I'm Jim Dow. Welcome to Say More. It wasn't long ago that finding an Asian American novelist in a local bookstore felt like finding a rare flower. Today, the options overflow. Viet Thanh Nguyen was on the leading edge of that wave. His first novel, The Sympathizer, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2016. Since then, he has written a sequel, a collection of short stories, books for children, and a book about the Vietnam War, among other works. He's also become an important public intellectual, promoting the work of immigrant and minority writers and advocating for Palestinian rights. I first met Viet when I was the op-ed editor at the New York Times, and I invited him to write for us. These days, he's a professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. We're honored to have him as a guest in our studio today. Viet Thanh Nguyen, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Jim. Such a pleasure to be here with you.
So we're in the Globe Studios here in Boston, just across the river from Harvard, where you gave the Norton Lectures in 2023 and 2024. And that's an exceptional honor for those who aren't familiar with it, reserved for literary, musical, and artistic titans from Igor Stravinsky to Toni Morrison to Herbie Hancock. You built your lectures around an expanding view of solidarity, and these lectures have become your most recent book, To Save and to Destroy, Writing as an Other. I want to start there because I think this concept really sums up a lot of the character of your work and writing that has defined your career. So tell me this concept of writing as other. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think it means for me that I've always had a sense of my own otherness, my own origin stories, that I came to the United States as a refugee, and my memories begin in a refugee camp. So there was always that sense that I was different in some way. As we can see today in our contemporary politics, that refugees make a convenient scapegoat for different kinds of political tensions in this country. And as a young person, I felt that otherness extremely personally because one of my earliest memories was being taken away from my parents and being put into a separate American sponsor household. So that should be definitive for a lot of people. And then as I grew up in the United States, I was constantly reminded that I was other in some way through popular culture, being denigrated as Asian through mainstream jokes and things like that, but also watching the Vietnam War being played out in the movies and realizing Vietnamese people are other, and I am one of these people, even though I feel like an American. And so that theme of duality of self and other always being in tension with each other is something that I would see repeatedly throughout my childhood and my adult life, and it affected the way that I read things, that I was attracted to works that dealt with otherness, whether it was an individualized otherness, which I think all of us have felt at one moment or another. It's part of what makes otherness a universal experience. But collective otherness, where an identity that you do not choose is imposed on you, that's actually a very important historical experience for many groups of people, including the groups to which I've belonged. And so I've spent a lifetime trying to figure out how I'm located in these traditions of self and otherness and how my reading has been shaped and how I can position myself as a writer.
Yeah, your childhood was really quite tumultuous, and it's probably something that many people would not suspect, given your accomplishments in the United States. Just talk for a moment about that period of being separated from your parents. How old were you? How long did that last? And who did they place you with?
I was 4, and what happened was that 130,000 Vietnamese refugees and thousands of Cambodians came to the United States as a consequence of the end of the war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in order to leave an American refugee camp, you had to have an American sponsor willing to take you. And so typically a sponsor, whether it was a family or a church or some kind of aid group, would take an entire family. Unusually, in our family's case, no one was willing to do that. One sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And in my case, that sponsor was a very nice Pennsylvanian Harrisburg family. I have no complaints about that. But when you're 4, you don't really understand that you're being taken away for any kind of positive reason. And the positive reason was to help my parents have enough time to get jobs, get on their feet, and so on. But when you're 4, you only experience this as abandonment, which is how I felt about it. And I was lucky because I got to come home after a few months. My brother, who was 10, didn't get to come home for 2 years.
Wow.
And so I think we were both shaped importantly by these experiences. I think it had a negative emotional impact that I didn't realize, you said you described my childhood as tumultuous. I would have described my childhood as normal
Hmm.
because I just normalized all these things. You had to
Yeah.
accept it. This is the price of being a refugee. My parents went through much worse things from my perspective.
Yeah.
So what was it? Why would I talk about my own personal traumas and so on? So that was how I came to accept that these things were just a part of my emotional landscape.
You've mentioned your parents, and they clearly have been important figures, not just in your life, but also in your writing. And you describe them, I think, in one of your books as having been twice exiled. First, when they fled the North to the South during the Civil War, and then from the South to the United States after Saigon, or maybe just before Saigon fell.
No, on the day Saigon fell.
On the day wow. You were young and you made that journey with them. Just tell us a little bit about their journey, how they ended up eventually in San Jose. I believe that's correct. That's where you grew up, correct?
Yeah.
Tell us a little about that.
When I look at my parents, I think they've had this epic life, which is also a life that they shared with so many hundreds of thousands of other Vietnamese people and other people from war-torn countries. They were born in the 1930s during the period of French colonization. They grew up in the 1940s when the Japanese came and occupied the country. They survived at a very young age a famine in North Vietnam that killed 1 million people. Then they became refugees twice, as you described. But in between those refugee experiences, they built a very successful life for themselves as business people in South Vietnam over the period of 1954 to 1975. And they did that without very much education. So they had this very impressive life that dealt with war, colonialism, all this kind of ruptures and tumult. And then by the time I knew them as a child in the 1970s, they had started perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California. So they had to build their lives all over again. It left me with this idea that in the United States, when we think of war stories, we usually think of soldiers. We have the luxury in the United States of having our wars mostly fought overseas. But for many people in many places, civilian stories, like my parents, are war stories too.
You've written about your life and as a refugee, and you've called yourself a refugee, but you've also, the Norton Lectures, for instance, you talk about your parents as having been exiles, and it's an interesting sort of semantical difference. And could you explain that? How do you see those as being two different things, or are they just different sides of the same coin?
I'm a writer, so words have connotations, and I think that these experiences of migration, refugee, exile, they're all part of the same family of human experiences, but they have different connotations that are important. And I think that refugees in our contemporary idea have really negative connotations. When you're a refugee, you're a part of a mass. You're forced to flee. Typically, refugees are depicted in very objectifying terms because they don't control their own narrative. So other people are looking at them. And in the case of Vietnamese people, the term that the Western media came up with to describe them was not just refugees, but boat people. And so that's a very negative connotation that nevertheless had this power to help in the rescue of so many Vietnamese refugees from boats and camps in the 70s and 80s. My parents are certainly among this group of people, and I don't renounce that experience at all because I embrace being called a refugee because it is a denigrated term, and I believe refugees have to stand up for other refugees. But exile is also a term that goes back much further. I mean, exile goes back to biblical times and undoubtedly before. But I think there's also something about exile that we understand to be very existential, and perhaps we're feeling this today. To be exiled is to be cast out from a community. As a person who is exiled, there is this potential to have great tragedy, but also great insight into the human and political condition because of the exile. But from the perspective of the people who have not been exiled, the idea of exile is, I think, terrifying. It means being thrown outside of the walls of the city-state, for example. And now if we look at our contemporary situation, we're using terms like deportation when we're casting people out. But I'm trying to find other words that might have more power than deportation, which seems very technical and legal and permissible. And exile might be one of those terms. I've just heard about one story of a Vietnamese American who was convicted for a horrible crime, did his time in prison for 25 years, understood that he was going to be sent back to Vietnam. Instead, and he accepted it, and his wife went to Vietnam to meet him after he was released from prison. Instead, the government just sent him to South Sudan. Now, to me,
Really?
that is not deportation. That is more like exile, but it is a part of the same human family as all these other ideas of forced migration that includes refugees.
Wow, that's a remarkable story. One more story about your family I'm interested in. Your parents left behind a sister, I believe an older sister, correct? And you met her decades later, I believe. That must have been an incredibly emotional moment. Could you tell us about it?
So I was 4 when I left Vietnam, so I certainly knew I had a sister at 4 years of age, but then I forgot. I forgot. And so, and the reason why we left her behind is because my mother was forced to flee by herself with her children, and she had to make a decision. And her decision was to leave my older sister behind, who was 16 at the time, to take care of the house and the family business. And apparently, my sister agreed with this. When I met her many years later and tried to understand more of what happened, she said, well, I did want to be responsible. I did want to do this. And of course, the assumption was not that we would be separated for decades, but that my mother and my parents would come back eventually. And the war and the finality of the fall of South Vietnam prevented that from happening for many decades. So sometime around 10, 11, 12 years of age, we receive a letter in San Jose, and there's a picture of this young woman in there. And I was like, who's this? And my parents were like, that's your adopted sister.
Wow.
And I was like, what? I have a sister? And so that was the beginning of a very important moment in my life where I realized that there's an absent presence in our house. We have a living ghost in the house. And that we shared that experience with so many other Vietnamese households, because every Vietnamese household I went to had similar black and white pictures of people who had been left behind for one reason or another. And it was a very formative moment for me, because I think it imbued me with a sense of survivor's guilt. Because why am I here and why is she there? What was the difference?
Right.
Why did my mother choose one over the other? I finally went back to, I think that was one reason why it took me a long time to go back to Vietnam, because I knew that going back to Vietnam was not simply going to be a personal encounter with the country. It would have to involve me meeting my sister and all the other people we had left behind. My father, for example, had left behind all of his siblings, 3 brothers, sister, left behind both his parents. So many people had been left behind. There would be so many emotional complications. So we finally arranged to meet, and just to compound things, my father was not happy about me going back to Vietnam. And he said, okay, fine, you're going back to Vietnam. I don't want you to do this, but you cannot go back to our hometown.
Really?
Which is where she was living. And so we made arrangements to meet, at another city 200 kilometers away. And, when I met her, she was by then in her 40s, and I was in my 30s. And beautiful woman shows up wearing very fashionable, hair's done, makeup, she's smiling, and she looks like she's having fun. And my family is a devout, stoic, dour Vietnamese Catholic family. We don't know how to have fun. So this was actually a really interesting moment. Of course, it was very emotional, but it was also sort of a moment of revelation that people have survived in different ways. And that was, I think, one way that she survived was to be someone who, unlike my family, retained a sense of pleasure. And that was actually meaningful for me.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I want to talk to you a little bit about becoming a writer. I think like a lot of Asian immigrant parents, yours probably weren't thrilled to hear that you wanted to be a writer. But obviously, from a very young age, you were just drawn to the written word. You read voraciously. I think you even wrote a novel in 3rd grade or something like that. So tell us about that process, and what did it take to overcome your parents' opposition, if that's a fair word for it?
Well, my poor parents never realized they were raising one of the most dangerous creatures you can find in your household, a writer. And I spared them that knowledge, actually, because I didn't write a novel in the 3rd grade, but I wrote a little illustrated and wrote my own book called Lester the Cat. Lester the Cat won a book award from the San Jose Public Library. My parents were working in their grocery store. They didn't even have the time to take me to the library to get my award, so the school librarian took me to get that award. I'm not sure my parents ever realized I wanted to be a writer, because I thought that would be too much information. My brother, for example, had gone to Harvard, and he had done philosophy, but he'd also done pre-med, so he became the doctor that they wanted. And he told me when I went to college. He said, well, just don't tell them that you're going to be an English major. Just say you're going to do pre-med. So I did pre-med for 11 weeks. That's all I could take. But then after that, I told my parents, okay, I'm going to do pre-law. I'll be a lawyer. And then, okay, that's fine. And then when I got to that stage where I had to choose whatever graduate program I was going to go to, I decided to go to get a PhD in English. And my parents were like, what does that mean? But they heard doctorate. And so doctorate was sort of a compromise. And they had no idea what I was doing as a professor of English, but at least it was a job in a university.
Right.
But I never said to them, I want to be a writer. I think maybe the first inkling my father got that I wanted to be a writer was when I published a short story and was translated into Vietnamese.
Yeah.
So I gave it to him. And then maybe the next time they realized I was for sure that I was a writer was when the Sympathizer came out. And because the Sympathizer won the Pulitzer Prize, everything was fine. But you cannot treat this as a normal condition of things. I got very lucky. But after that, I think the way that they reconciled with it, we never talked about the content of my books. If they paid attention to the Vietnamese language news, I'm sure they discovered that I'm not popular with the Vietnamese refugee community.
Interesting. Yeah.
But we never talked about it. Instead, the only thing my father ever asked me about in terms of my books, besides having me take pictures with him in my books, was how many copies I've sold, and that made him happy. And I thought that's all that I need.
That's funny. In your Norton lectures, you talk about how you read voraciously. You worked your way through the Western canon as an adolescent or maybe even younger, and you absorbed these books by oftentimes dead white men, largely. Much of which you loved. You came to really appreciate their skill and their plots and their characters. But you said something interesting in the lectures where you said that you sort of also realized that they weren't writing to make sure for like a Vietnamese refugee kid. They were just writing to an audience that would understand them because it was just assumed that audience would understand them. And there was an important realization for you there that as a writer you would have to learn how to just write as if everybody understood what you were and who you were about. And that struck me as a fascinating sort of like moment. How did you incorporate that into the way you approached writing?
I think that was a long struggle to realize something so simple as that, because this is one of the distinctions, I think, between being a part of a majority and being a part of a minority, however you choose to distinguish these populations. When you're a part of a majority, I think you can oftentimes make the assumption that people do know what you're talking about. The world of cultural, political references that you have are things that you think you share with your audience. And when you're a part of the minority, you can't have that. You don't necessarily have that assumption. And that, for a lot of people who are so-called minorities, can produce a sense of dissonance and anxiety. Like if we speak our truth, whatever our truth is as some part of a minority, maybe the majority won't understand us. And the reason that's important is because the majority controls the levers of power. I think too often minority writers have felt the temptation to explain and to translate. And I argue that this is a deformation. Now, in some circumstances, you want to explain and translate. I understand there's a necessity for those kinds of things. And all of us who have been immigrant or refugee kids of parents who don't speak the English language, that's a very common trope that the kids then serve as interpreters for their parents, right? But that's not what literature should do.
Right.
Literature is not a self-help manual. Literature is not a how-to kind of thing.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with Viet Thanh Nguyen. We've talked a little bit about your first novel, The Sympathizer. And for people who haven't read it, the novel is this incredibly layered story about a half Vietnamese, half French man who becomes a spy for the North Vietnamese military, infiltrates the inner circle of a South Vietnamese general, and eventually the general and the spy flee to California, where the plot takes all kinds of crazy twists and turns. Just talk for a moment about how you decided to take what might have started as a sort of classic immigrant refugee story and then kind of turned it on its head this way, turning into a spy and detective story in a way.
Before I wrote The Sympathizer, I'd already written a collection of short stories, which was published as The Refugees, but it was published after The Sympathizer. And The Refugees does exactly what you just described, talk about the refugee or immigrant experience and so on. And, there are well-worn tropes and patterns for doing all of that, because if you are a refugee or an immigrant or different in some way in the United States, you're offered this opportunity to tell the story of your people, right? And I felt an obligation to do that. But after I wrote The Refugees, I didn't feel that obligation anymore. I felt like I've done my filial duty to the Vietnamese community, and now I want to write something for me and something that would be more fun for me. And so that's where the Sympathizer was born, because it was born out of a sense of this desire to write a book for myself and not for anybody else, to write a book that would not perform some kind of ethnographic or sociological function, and to write a book that would be entertaining. So I had to fashion the character of my spy very carefully, and I deliberately made him mixed race. So his father's a French priest, his mother's a poor Vietnamese woman, because I felt that someone who was Eurasian, as they were called in that time, would automatically be subjected to so many historical and cultural pressures that if he was intelligent and educated, would allow him to be a commentator on all of these kinds of historical and cultural kinds of issues. And, in the end, he's also a smartass. So he's not some kind of somber figure who's, humorless. He's actually got a very bitter and sarcastic sense of humor, like myself. And his humor helps to make his politics, hopefully, go down easier, along with this whole spy narrative that gives a lot of dramatic propulsion to the narrative.
The book is obviously beyond a tale of refugees, also a commentary to some degree on the war in Vietnam. And you've often said over the years that you have to almost remind people that Vietnam is a country, not a war. And yet, Americans, I think, to some degree, still think of it first as a war and then as a country, secondarily. Now, you told me recently that you had pledged not to write anything about the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. I think you may have broken that pledge. I'm not sure. But why do you feel that way about the war?
It's such an exhausting topic, It's an exhausting topic. And it's an exhausting topic because I don't really think either Vietnam or the United States, for all the energies that both countries have expended on acts of memory and narrative and history, have, from my point of view, fully or inadequately understood the ramifications of the war. From the American point of view, this is still an American war. And it's so hard for me and anybody else who's Vietnamese or Southeast Asian to overcome that. It's just embedded into the culture. So the Sympathizer, being told from a Vietnamese point of view, was unsettling from the beginning. It was rejected by 13 out of 14 publishers. The 14th publisher who bought it was not American. He was English and he was mixed race. I've spent so much time over the past decade talking about the Vietnam War. I think it's important to do so, but it's also hard because there is so much education that has to be done for non-Vietnamese Americans to really grapple with their own prejudices and assumptions on this.
Interesting. Well, sticking with the topic of war, but shifting wars, you've become a very outspoken supporter of Palestinian rights and the Palestinian people. And in one of your Norton lectures, you talk very passionately about why you think Asian Americans should empathize with the plight of Palestinians. How did you come to that sort of commitment to that cause?
I think as a whole, one of the reasons why Palestine has become an important issue is because the Israeli treatment of Palestinians, U.S. support for Israel, is to me a condensation of so many of contradictions in our own history of the United States. Doing actions like settler colonialism, conquering places, eradicating peoples, and then just forgetting that these things have happened, and then arguing that we are a country of freedom and liberty and democracy and so on. And so what happens in Palestine is a repetition of some of these issues, but also a repetition of the attempt at erasure, the repetition at the attempt to say we are we support liberty and democracy except for this group of people. Okay, so that's why I think Palestine is symbolically and politically important for the United States as a whole. For Asian Americans, if you compare the history of anti-Muslim representation in the United States, it overlaps pretty clearly with anti-East Asian, anti-Southeast Asian representation. So we've gone from racist images of Fu Manchu, for example, to repetitions of this in Osama bin Laden or Yahya Sinwar. So I see very clear continuities.
After Biden won in 2020, you wrote an essay for the New York Times saying you were now concerned that the country would sort of pull back from political conversations and difficult political conversations, and that writers and artists would do the same and sort of fall into their pre-Trump personas, I think is how sort of you described it. Some people probably said, well, politically minded art isn't great art to begin with. But now we're in the second term of the Trump administration. The democracy seems more at risk than ever. How do you feel now? Like, do you feel more strongly than ever about this? And what do you think the role of the writer should be in this moment?
I think the end of that essay, which is called The Post-Trump Future of Literature, I believe, actually ended with Palestine. Actually talked about a Palestinian-American poet and so on. And of course, by the time we get to the end of the Biden administration and the beginning of the Trump 2 era, that's exactly what took place. That now, if the first Trump era was defined largely around domestic politics, that we now would look back and say these were the cultural war politics of DEI, immigration, and so on. That's been magnified now through anti-Semitism and Palestine. And again, a lot of what I said in that essay in 2020, I think came true because the ability of the American literary establishment to respond to the late Biden, early Trump era has been pretty weak. The literary establishment has been able to respond to domestic issues. Like, of course, we're going to mobilize around DEI, for example, but the literary establishment just kind of fell apart around the question of Palestine. Every society is contradictory, and every society will manifest absurdities and hypocrisies. It's easy to point to the absurdities and hypocrisies of Donald Trump if you're a Democrat, for example. But can you point to the absurdities and hypocrisies of your own side or to the absurdities and hypocrisies that are fundamental to your society as a whole? That, to me, is political, oppositionally political. And that is exactly where the most powerful art can stand. And oftentimes when we look back on the works that have been canonized, that's exactly what writers have done.
You've talked about leaving academia. I don't know if you've talked about that publicly, but
I have.
You have. Why is that, and what's next for you?
I've spent over 30 years in academia as a grad student and as a professor. It's been obviously a very formative experience for me and taught me a lot, shaped my writing. But I don't think I have anything more to learn from it as a human being. It's like, so many things I can learn from interactions with other professors. And being in academia is very comforting. I have job security, I have a nice paycheck, et cetera. I'm walking away from all that. My parents would be shocked. They've passed away. I don't know if I could have done this while my parents were still alive, because my parents would be like, "Are you kidding me? You walking away from this paycheck?" And like, the whole reason I became a professor, I could justify it to myself, was because at 21 years of age, I heard about something called tenure. Yeah. I was like, oh, you can't get fired? This is I want this. Because I thought, once I get tenure, I can do whatever I want to do. I can be a writer, which is exactly, eventually, what happened. But I think, being a writer is also about risk-taking in so many ways. Risk-taking in terms of art, risk-taking in terms of emotions, risk-taking in terms of just your life and what you do and how you speak, or how I speak. And so I just feel now is the time. I need to learn new things that I'm no longer learning from academia. And as a writer, I've always tried to challenge myself in one way or another, whether it's through questions of form, questions of emotion. And now with leaving academia, I also think it's about taking chances and seeing how my writing will be impacted when I'm no longer a professor. Exciting, but also daunting at the same time.
Well, we look forward to what comes next. Viet Thanh Nguyen is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the novel The Sympathizer, among many other books. He's also a professor, for now, at the University of Southern California. Viet, thanks so much for being with us.
Jim, it was great talking to you.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Our producer is Caitlin Harrop, and our sound engineer is Uzair Ahmed. If you like the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get podcasts. We can be reached at saymore@globe.com. I'm Jim Dow. Thanks for listening.